What if I told you there was a demonic beast out there preying on the unsuspecting? In the past on this channel we've covered big cats, but what if there is something else? The black dog. Today we'll be talking about some of the folklore, some of the facts, and I'll also be talking about my own experience of the black dog. Most people describe a large black dog with a shaggy coat and large red eyes. Most iterations of the story describe a hellish beast that brings misfortune and death, whilst other renditions depict the beast as a guardian or protector. Black dog stories are some of the oldest and most widespread folktales across the British Isles, but stories differ as with any folktale. One of the first stories of the black dog places it in France rather than Britain, and it's said that in 850 AD, within a church, a dog materialised and hunted up and down the pews. With it, it brought darkness. Of course, in Britain, Black Shuck is probably one of the most famous black dogs, and it's said that this dog hunts along the highways and footpaths of East Anglia. The term shuck likely derives from two old terms, one meaning to terrorise and the other the devil. If wandering alone, you may hear it howling in the distance, but its footsteps make no sound as it approaches you in the dark. One of the most famous accounts of Black Shuck comes from a church in 1577 in Suffolk. It is said that the dog barged through the doors with a clap of thunder, running up the aisle and murdering two people before quickly disappearing. Now, this is probably one of the most famous accounts of the black dog, and yet it's probably also one of the most famous accounts in which the black dog is perceived as an evil entity and of malicious intent. But there are other stories too. In fact, the county over from this in Lincolnshire, the black dog is actually Hairy Jack. And Hairy Jack is said to be a protective presence, in fact. Although he is still a hellhound, he is said to protect the local people and wandering travellers. Now the question is there any fact to these folklores? Now, the reason I'm stood in this field is sort of to prove a point really, and that is that all of these stories are pretty much coming from farming communities. And I think that's an important note. Working dogs particularly are a normal part of rural life, even in those times. And in fact, more so in those times, they would have been an essential part of farms. And so there shouldn't be such a strong fear of dogs that you might get in communities that don't readily use dogs. However, that also brings me to another point, and that is that many farming communities are highly reliant on their livestock, particularly here in the UK. So this may lead to that fear of dogs equally. Although they are an important part of the farming lifestyle, they are also a huge threat to livestock, particularly young, like calves and lambs. And so the idea of a big stray dog on the loose not only is a threat to human life, but also to farming livelihoods, which at the time could have been detrimental if you were to lose part of your livestock. And so then you can imagine that actually in these heavily religious rural communities, that if, say, some of your livestock was lost to a dog, you might start to think that it's a bad omen, or maybe something sent by the devil himself to punish you. So there becomes this real mix of the real fear of, say, an attack from a dog and the effect that will have on people's lives, but also mixing it in with religious connotations of demon, devils and bad omens. Obviously, for the less malicious stories such as Hairy Jack, people also work alongside dogs, and guardian livestock dogs were a common feature in the countryside. So again, it could be misidentification, or it could just be a folktale based off real concepts of having protective dogs there in farming communities, such as livestock guardians, and that in itself becomes a good omen for people. I think it's worth noting that from my own research on this topic, one thing that I've found is that the sightings of black dogs have been a lot less than, say, the big cats that we talked about in previous episodes. Although black dog sightings have lasted for hundreds of years since some of the original stories, such as Black Shuck, there are far fewer reported stories, especially in, say, major news headlines that talk about black dog sightings. And perhaps it's because it's all a myth, perhaps people don't want to come out and talk about this, or perhaps it just seems like misidentification of, say, a stray dog. Now, I probably wouldn't have covered this story based on the lack of sort of more recent sightings within, say, the last 100 years, although there have been a few. But the main reason I want to cover this story is that I believe I may have had a black dog sighting myself.
Now this story starts about 10 years ago when I was a teenager, and I'd be walking home from school after getting off the bus. And as I've grown up in rural communities, we typically would have to walk through, say, the fields and around fishing lakes to get home. And so I did my usual route where I would get off the bus. And I think it's important to note as well that I have grown up around dogs. I'm not scared of them in the slightest. And yet we were walking home, me and my brother. The sun was setting, things were starting to turn into sort of dark silhouettes around us, so losing some of the detail, but still light enough to see most of the things around us. And we were going up through the field like we would usually do, and waiting at the end was this large, sort of beastly figure of, say, a dog. Again, I've grown up with dogs, and so I'm familiar with what most dogs look like, and there was something just not right about this dog. I remember describing it as being the size of, say, a wolf, and it just stood there right in the middle with what appeared to be no owners around, and it terrified me at the time. And we ended up turning around and just sprinting. We jumped over the large cattle fence, and then we took another route around to get home. And like I say, I distinctly remember telling people at the time that it was like the size of a wolf and couldn't discern much details, and so I can only assume that it was of a darker colour. And yes, this case could be simple misidentification, and we could have just been simply looking at a large dog that someone was walking and we just missed the walker. But to this day, it still feels like there was something off about that time, and I still remember at the time being absolutely petrified of it. So take it as you will, but that was my own experience. Now, if you've had an experience of the black dog, whether you're from Britain or afar, I'd love to hear your story in the comments too.